Can you hear me? For the first time ever, people told me I didn't speak loudly enough on the last lecture. I got really excited about it because my wife tells me to speak less. And so anytime somebody actually wants to hear me is very exciting. How are you? And no, this is not deja vu. You are seeing me again. And yes, the topic is Umbral de Hell? And no, I do not mean to put you through hell. But thank you for being here. We really appreciate you being here, and we're excited about this topic. And is everybody paying attention? Because if you're not, I can do this. Now everybody's paying attention. Yes. It generally goes like that, though, isn't it? We have this image of hell in our minds for whatever reason, and it generally involves fire. And have you ever asked yourself, where did that come from? Is that really true? And for us who have become accustomed to studying Spiritism a little bit, a new word has come about as well, and it's umbral. And it's a really weird word. And it oftentimes, by habit, we equate umbral to fire and these things. So what we hope to do today, if that is okay with you, is to talk a little bit about the concepts of hell as we see through different religions' perspectives, and then talk about what umbral is according to the Spiritist view and try to reconcile them a little bit to see if that makes sense. Is that okay with you? If not, remember, I will do this. I wanted to start by telling you a little story that hopefully frames everything that we are going to do here today. I want to tell you a story of two Buddhist monks who were in Tibet. And friends that they woke up in the morning and took their morning walk. And every so often, these two Buddhist monks would do exactly that. And this particular day being a beautiful one, they were walking and thinking and meditating when one of them saw these beautiful flags up. And he stopped in that moment of beauty and turned to his friend and said, "Wow, how beautiful. Look at the flags moving." And his friend then turned around and looked at the flag and said, "It's not the flag that's moving, it is the wind that is moving." And the first one stopped and said, "It is the flag that moves." The second one looked at him patiently, as I imagine all Buddhist monks probably do, and said, "You're mistaken, good friend. It is the wind that is moving." And what ensued for the next couple of minutes was a lively discussion as to whether the flag was moving or the wind was moving. And it was a cause for that. And they could not settle this dispute. So they went back to the temple and decided to consult upon their leader, or so the story goes. And as they came closer to him and laid out their different arguments, their leader stopped and said, "It is not the flag that moves. It is not the wind that moves. It is your mind that moves." And with that, so the story goes, the two Buddhist monks walked away into reflection. And I feel this story is appropriate because it has to deal with one of the important things that we are going to talk about today, which is the power of our minds. And how, as the Greek philosopher Anaximander said, man is the measure of all things, of things they are, that they are, of things that are not, that they are not. That is a very fancy way of saying we create our own reality. What we perceive to be oftentimes become our reality. And what we perceive not to be also becomes our reality. So as we go through our steps today, talking about the concept of hell, I want us to use our minds to figure out how we want to shape our reality. We're going to use the tool of the mind to arrive at that conclusion, hopefully. Does that make sense? Okay. So where do we start? Let's visit some of our old traditions to understand where the concept of hell comes from. This whole fiery and brimstone thing that we have. If we look back into Greek mythology, which could be considered a way of religiously looking at the world, we'll find the Greeks that a long time ago, they had this thing, the underworld, called Hades. And the confusing thing about Hades is both a place for them and a deity, somebody who lived there, the lord of the underworld. And inside Hades, which was where everybody went after they passed, we find Tartarus. And Tartarus, it is an abyss, a dark place. It was first the prison for the Titans, this really big primordial goddesses that didn't behave very well, and they were put into Tartarus to isolate them. But later on, we see that according to the tradition, it was a place for people who had to do some kind of punishment for some specific actions that they've done, right? And so what we see here is an image of King Sisyphus, and King Sisyphus was condemned to roll a boulder up a hill in Tartarus, all the way to the end, to the top. And when he got to the top, the boulder would roll down to the beginning, and he would come down again and get that boulder and push it up the hill again until he got to the top, and guess what? He was condemned for the rock to fall back down, and his punishment would be to forever do this in Tartarus. All that for being a somewhat very severe king who killed visitors and, amongst other things, didn't necessarily make friends with Zeus, the god. We can go into his story later, but you get the sense. What I find really interesting, too, that according to mythology, Hades was located 9 days below Earth by a bronze anvil's drop. So if you dropped a bronze anvil from Earth, which was probably flat at that time, in case you're wondering, and in case you're here for part 1, 9 days later you would hit Hades. As a matter of fact, from heaven too. If you dropped a bronze anvil from heaven, I don't know why you would do that from heaven, but if you did, it would take 9 days to reach the earth, and if you did it again 9 days later, you hit Hades. But that was a little bit of a concept in the Greek mythology of where the underworld was. It wasn't necessarily a place of fire, but it was a place where people would be sent to if they had particular things that they needed to work out. If we move on, and I'm going to move relatively quick about these because the stories are interesting, but they're not the main point. I think we want to kind of see the whole, if that's okay with you. I also want to pick something from the Nordic tradition because we don't often talk about it. According to the Finnish mythology in Finland, the underworld was called Tuonela. And in Tuonela, everybody who passed from this physical body, good or bad, would go there. So it wasn't necessarily a place of punishment, but just where people went. And became shadow-like ghosts over there. And there's a beautiful piece of work here. You can kind of see how we have people who are obviously naked, but they also have people with clothes here, as they normally would with shoes. That's their lives. They had their own instruments of their own, the previous trade. They just carried on living in this Tuonela place. What I find fascinating about it is that it was possible for the living to visit Tuonela. If you walked for 4 weeks through a desert and then went through a river, eventually you could get to Tuonela as a living person. So it wasn't a separate, disconnected place that nobody could go to. The living could also go to Tuonela. And if you were a shaman, you could go into trance and visit it as well. But it's fascinating because now we see that there is an ability to go back and forth between the realm of the dead taking place. And why would you go to Tuonela, if you ask me? A good question. You would go to get information or to get some spells. What else, right? But that was the Finnish mythology perspective on the underworld. With me so far? Okay. If we look back at Hinduism, which is a beautiful and ancient tradition, we are going to find Yamaloka. And Yamaloka is a temporary purgatory. This is what's very interesting about the Hindu tradition. And according to the Vedas and the sacred books, The Yamaloka, which was a temporary purgatory, was ruled by Lord Yama. And Lord Yama was the first human, so he got there first, he got to rule it. Good deal. And what would happen is Lord Yama had his friend Chitragupta, who was the official record keeper. And every time that somebody passed or died, they would go into Yamaloka, and then, I don't know if you can see very well here, but here is Lord Yama, and to his right side is Chitragupta, and they would go before them. And Chitragupta was the record keeper, and he'll keep tabs on all the actions all living beings have ever done. And based on that, Lord Yama then would assign you to one specific Naraka, which was a hell-like place, but it really wasn't real because it was temporary. After you were there for a certain time to atone for whatever it is that your shortcomings were, you could either go to heaven or you could be sent back into earth to be reincarnated, which is a fascinating thing because you see here then the hell, so to speak, is not hell at all. It's purgatory, right? It's temporary in nature. And what's fascinating that even in the epic of the Mahabharata, even the Pandavas, which were the really wise folks, still also spent a little bit of time at Yamaloka for their sins. They still had a little bit to atone for until they could move on. And I find it fascinating by the Hindu tradition. Now, if we shift into Buddhism, which also has many different traditions, we will see something very similar. We also find some Buddhist traditions that talk about the Naraka, which was, for the Buddhist folks, the worlds of greatest suffering. This is really, really interesting because for the Buddhists, Naraka is not an eternal thing, but it just lasts very long. What's very interesting, too, is that beings remain there until they burn up all the karma, all the negative actions, and after that, they leave. We're not clear exactly where they go, but they leave. And what's fascinating, too, about here, and this is a mural from northern Thailand, and you can see some people in Naraka there getting, a jacuzzi, a spiritual jacuzzi. And I say that in the nicest possible way, because I would not like to picture that for real. What's interesting here is that no deity was involved in the actual process of sending people there. According to the Buddhist piece, this happened by karma, by the natural law of attraction. You automatically went there without a being actually taking you there, which is fascinating because we don't see that very often as well. So you can see how the traditions are somewhat different. And of course, in Judaism, which is very key to our understanding of the Western world, of the Judaico-Christian traditions, it's a fascinating philosophy in religion in general because it has no specific doctrine of the afterlife. There isn't much talk about the afterlife, but there are something what we call the Sheol, the realm of the dead, where both good people and bad people go after they die. And with time, these concepts also evolve, it's important to say. They change. And there's also the concept of Gehenna, which was originally a grave where the dead went, but with time, with piling on more dead, became an interesting place that became purgatory-like. You would go for a specific amount of time. And we're also going to find references to Gehenna being like the Hinnom Valley, which is a picture of this valley over here, which was outside of Jerusalem, which is a place where pagans would do their sacrifices and leave the carcasses behind. And so it was a very smelly and dirty place, full of blood and death and flies. And for that, people would constantly set it afire to clean it up. So that's where I see a lot of our concepts of the eternal fires coming from, which was this ugly, stinky valley nearby that people start talking about being so bad that nobody wanted to be there. So we see Gehenna being that. But what's really fascinating about the concept of hell, according to Judaism, is that it's really not a physical place. That once you pass, it is a mental state of mind where you become aware of your own shortcomings and you go into shame, and shame then being the ultimate hell. Of course, again, caveat that this is a very broad generalizations I'm making. These are fantastic philosophies that spans for thousands of years, so really basic covering over here. And Christianity is no different, really, when we come to think about it. We have many different denominations that have different perspectives toward this. The Adventists think that death is an unconscious sleep until the time of the second Christ, when everybody will be resurrected. At that point, if you were the wicked, you would just stop existing. You would just be spiritually annihilated, which is an interesting piece, right? The LDS, the Latter-day Saints Church, says that hell is also a state between death and resurrection, and only those who do not accept the Christ will stay there after the resurrection. So it's slightly different, starts to change a little bit. You see how even within one tradition we can see different flavors? And Jehovah's Witnesses, for instance, have a very peculiar view in which 144,000 people will be chosen, the best ones, to rule the earth with the Christ after the end of the world. And that the rest of us, if we're not in one of those 144,000, can only hope to come back to earth, to a better earth, after Armageddon has taken place. And that's where we would live. Very different as well. And in sharp contrast, we find the Unitarian Universalists who believed in universal reconciliation, basically saying that all of us, all human souls, eventually will be reconciled with God. So there is no hell for them either. So you can see how there's various different perspectives towards going the same thing. And I would be remiss as well if I didn't mention Islam, which about 600 BC also introduced the concept of Jahannam, which is one of the names for this concept of hell and purgatory. And it's very interesting because the Quran tells us there are 7 levels of Jahannam, as well as there are 7 levels of heaven. And according to the Quran, the world will be destroyed in the last day, and we all will be raised up again after the last day to be judged by Allah. And then we would figure things out. The only caveat here is if you're an enemy of Islam, you don't get to wait until the time, you go straight into hell. Like you get a fast pass, right? Which is understandable because, right, if you're an enemy of the good and of kindness and everything else, then why wait, right? Here's a picture of Prophet Muhammad, Burak and Gabriel over here. The image is not that great, I'm sure, but they're observing some women being punished and fires as well. What's interesting about Islam as well, that are not all Muslims, and scholars agree whether hell is a eternal destination or whether some people, after being there for a while, will achieve forgiveness. It's not clear. All these people have, within the same denomination, disagree on how things are done, right? Which is kind of what I'm trying to get at. If we were to do some takeaways from all these different things, a couple of things might pop up in our minds as it pertains to the concept of hell. One of them being that we can't, all these different locations cannot really agree on where it is, where it's located, right? Some people say that you can drop the envelope for 9 days and it will be under earth. Some people don't believe it exists at all. Some people think that you go after you die. Other people think that you can actually walk there. So where is it? It's very different depending on who you speak to. Something else that comes on as well is, and this is a fascinating training, there's always a reckoning. That is, there's always some kind of coming to your senses or judgment. What differs here is who's doing it and when it happens. For some folks, you yourself do it after your passing, and for others, you have formerly people judging you on all your acts before. And so that's very interesting. But they all agree that there is a sense of coming to terms and re-evaluating your position in the universe. And something else that we cannot agree on, according to the different traditions, is whether it's a permanent thing or a temporary thing. Is that something that you go forever? Is it really hell? Or is it more like purgatory, you go for a little bit? You can see that there's different perspectives, right? But what's also very interesting is that you see that it's not a one-size-fits-all generally, right? Everybody that goes to one of these places has a little bit of an individualized punishment, for lack of a better word for right now. They have some kind of remediation that fits their penalties, so to speak. It's not like, hey, everybody jump into the hot water, right? It depends on whatever you do, there is a course of action for it, which I find fascinating. Because for some reason, in my mind, I don't know if that's the case with you, but the traditional concept of hell is this generic place full of ashes and brimstone that everybody goes and everybody suffers there at the same time. But the traditions tell us that's not the case, right? That we could have different experiences if we were to go to hell because we're different people. I find that fascinating because I wasn't thinking about that before. And so we see that we have diverse beliefs, but we have no unified concept. We can't have all these people agree on some things, just some general understanding. Does that make sense? So we take a break then and move into Umbral, because it's important for us. If you're going to say, if we're going to ask the question, is Umbral the new hell, then we need to understand what hell is. And then on the other hand, we need to understand what we call Umbral, right? And it's tough, especially for us who are English speaking, because the definition of the word Umbral is hard to find in English because it's not really common. What you find in English is the word umbra, which is darkest part of a shadow, right? Yes, and there's different gradations of shade, right? But that's it. And so umbral will be the adjective, when you put an L of it, of that shadow. So from the moment that you look at that from just plainly from the English language, you think that it's necessarily a place of shadow and darkness, because that's what it's equating to. But in fact, when we look at the original Portuguese meaning of the word umbral, it's slightly different. In Portuguese, where this word originally comes from in the Spiritist context and tradition, it can also mean this threshold, this door threshold, where one space becomes another. So it is this transition phase between one place and another in the door. You have, the frames, and on the floor, on the ground, you have the umbral, which is that piece of wood or stone that transitions you from one space to the next. Very big different understandings, right? You can see how they can create some confusion. So we want to clear the air a little bit and say, well, where was this word first used in the Spiritist context? The first time that it was used in the Spiritist context that I am aware of is in the book Nosso Lar, which was written in 1944, so a ways back, by the spirit André Louis. It was psychographed. It was dictated spiritually to this medium, Francis Xavier. And in that book is the first time that we see the word umbral coming up, at least to my knowledge. And that book narrates the experience of the author, André Louis, who spends approximately 8 years in this lower zone, dark place, which he calls umbral. And understandably, eventually he moves on. I'm not going to tell you the whole story, but you probably know if you're here. If you don't, it's an interesting book to read. It starts with his experiences in the umbral, so sometimes puts some people off because it's not a happy place. But then it tells the story of how he moved on and was a great worker, and for which we are very grateful because we have many great books by him. But in the story, we see a couple of things that are very telling for us. It's a temporary lower zone place that he stays there. And if we look at chapter 12 of the book, there's a little quote here, and the instructor Lysias tells us that umbral works as a region for the removal of foul mental residues, things in our minds, right? It's a type of purgatorial zone where one slowly burns away the unhealthy fuel of illusions, which is acquired through the misuse of an opportunity for learning on earth. So this is the place where we go to kind of burn out this mental fluids and ideas that we had erroneously built while on earth for not doing the right thing. Which is really curious and really interesting because it puts things a little bit in perspective to us. So what does that mean? Well, let's take a look at umbral then and see what we learn from all of this context. What we learn is that the location of umbral is really not defined. It's not one specific place, but it varies according to the needs of people because, again, right, people are different and they have different mental residues from different experiences, so there's not one physical place that is umbral. The other one is that if we go back and look at the reckoning piece or the judgment piece, we also see that's present. It's not a one-time thing. It's not a you go there, pass judgment, all of a sudden you get it, but you slowly, according to the Spiritist tradition, begin to get more and more clarity after you passed about your state of being. So it's ongoing, and it's also compounded by the loss of the physical body, because the physical body is denser. I think we talked about before, and many of you were here before, so I risk myself by repeating some of the things I said before earlier, and I apologize if I did. But for context, we have gathered information that tells us that once our spirit leaves our physical body, it can more freely move and more freely perceive the world because it doesn't have this heavy suit around it. And so it can more clearly see our past experiences. Our mind can work stronger. So our feelings are more intense. Our perceptions are more intense. And so our reckoning, so to say, becomes more intense with passing of time too. So our judgment, as we acquaint ourselves with the spiritual world and are able to better understand our human experience, will become more detailed and therefore stronger for us. So it's an ongoing process. Additionally, we also find that in the Spiritist tradition, it has to be a temporary thing, because we also learn that spirits are evolving and they are not to be stuck in a place forever. So it's a short-lived experience if you take into consideration the immortality of the soul, right? At the same time, we also see, again, this individualized learning component, that we go to the experiences for which we have caused or triggered some of these mental residues that we need to vanquish or expel. Does that make sense? It's a little abstract, right? But I guess you get to what I am pointing at, which is, yes, we have diverse experiences, but we have the same concept in Spiritism. That is, the concept that one could potentially go and find themselves in such a place. It's common throughout what we see. However, what the place looks like, and if you ever go there or not, it depends. It's diverse. Depends on the person, right? And that's a little bit of the difference. With me so far? Who's sleeping? Raise your hand. Okay. If you raise your hand, people, you're not sleeping. Just want to say. All right. Thank you. All right. All that to say, so from what we see here so far, could we call Umbral the new hell? Well, no, because hell is permanent, right? And Umbral is at least temporary, this passage between realms. So we couldn't call it hell. In fact, it is debatable whether we can call some of the experiences dictated by other traditions hell too, because they are also not permanent. So the whole idea of fire and brimstone, especially fire, that sometimes gets stuck in our common conscious or cultural awareness, is not exactly the most accurate one according to the traditions themselves. So we need to turn the fire off, right? We need to get that out of there, of our conscious and unconscious behavior. Following so far? What I'm saying is we're building our castle of thoughts and ideas in things that might not necessarily be that which we think they are. And that's why it's important for us to work with our minds, to work back and question and understand the world around us and make sense of it, to see whether these truths or these ideas or these concepts are really adequate for us. They fit the way we see the world and we want to behave. Okay, Daniel, we sort of answered the original question, but here's the bigger question. So, like, you can technically pick things apart and say, okay, I get that technically Umbral is not hell, but what really happens? Because if we are to be critical, we saw 7 different traditions. We tossed Spiritism on top of it, 8 different versions of things. And the question becomes, how do I reconcile all of these? Some people might say, which one is right? Is the flag moving or is the wind moving? Which one is it? It is the mind. It's whichever one you decide to adopt, right? But we need to ask ourselves, how do we build the situation we find ourselves in? And how can we investigate? Can we lend one more credence than the other? Can we, using our minds, find some clarity that perhaps otherwise we have not yet? Let's try. So when we look at the whole picture with all these different things, maybe there are a couple of extra things that we can do. We dive into the question and talk about, again, something that I touched upon before, is how did we acquire this information? Well, religion over time has gathered this information and passed for us, and the game of telephone that I talked about before also reigns true here. We have been getting our information from people who got their information, from other people who got their information, from other people that got their information, and now are passing to us. And so even our concept of hell as it's normally built, and fire and brimstone, doesn't hold true if we look back at the original writings from many of these different religions. So we need to ask ourselves, who's telling me that information? And I mentioned earlier today, and sorry for being repetitive, but a lot of times back in the day when we got that information, our understanding of the world has changed dramatically because religious thought generally goes differently than scientific thought. If the scientific thought generally goes from the small to the large, you look at facts and you find eventually rules and hypotheses and rules that work from different facts. The religious world is generally different. You have one revelation, one idea, and one way of looking at life that's developed, and then you developed how to live from there. So it kind of go in different directions, and we need to reconcile them a little bit, because if we don't, we are going to find ourselves holding up to beliefs and ideas that have been passed down to us through generations or even different incarnations that we may bring from before, from our past experiences, and haven't just really looked at it. Kind of like that thing that just sits there forever, right? We all have that shirt in our closet that's been there forever, and maybe you don't use it and you don't even know when you used it last, but it's still there, and you won't throw it away. So some of these thoughts and some of these ideas are sitting in a closet of our mind, and we just take them for granted. We haven't gone back and say, hey, does this shirt fit? Let me tell you, that shirt will not fit for me. But you get what I mean? And so sometimes we need to kick the tires of the ideas we previously had to see if they still hold true, so that we are not looking at a very complex world of billions of galaxies and stars with so much sophisticated, still thinking that the Earth is flat or on top of turtles, as it was previously conceived. We need to adequate ourselves to that belief and see what holds true and what doesn't hold true. How could we possibly do it? I might sound like a broken record, maybe because I am a broken record. But there's this. And that's perhaps the fascinating thing about Spiritism, is that it has been able to operate at the edge of religion and at the start of science. What do I mean? I mean that most religious traditions, although, as you've seen here, sometimes have trouble prescribing and telling us what the afterlife look like, they do know it happens, and they tell you it's important for you to be a good person, which we all agree with, right? But the specifics of how to do that, or what's going to happen after you die, or where you go to, are not very clear. At the same time, science, which is concerned with the physical world, struggles to make sense of things that are that subtle, although we're getting there. Because matter is becoming, as science is able to peer more and more into matter and the atom and smaller things and quantum physics, it stops being matter, it becomes energy. So we're getting there too. And in the middle lives Spiritism, which is able to study the relationship of souls and spirits, what we are, where do we come from, where do we go, and how all that interacts. And because of that, and because of two wonderful things that we have, mediumship and the other wonderful concept brought forth by this man Allan Kardec in one of his magazines called The Universal Control of the Spirits, we have been able since the 1850s to somewhat experiment, almost, I want to say scientifically, but not test tube science. We've been able to experiment systematically with the interaction between the realms of the living and of the living on the other side, because there's no dead and no living, right? We're all living. Through the experiences and experiments that Kardec started in the 1850s, where he would go and communicate with the spirits here and ask them a question, then go over there and ask the same question and see if they match, and then go in third place and ask them and triangulate all this information, we began to do a little bit of a scientific process in our quest for good, actual information that we can rely on. And when he was doing that, somebody else was doing the same thing. And he asserted in the Spiritist Review, a magazine that he used to publish, and is still in publication today, has been resurrected and reincarnated, I should say, he explained the idea of the universal control of the spirits. And this is the idea behind it. If God is good and kind, that God must be to be God, right? That's the definition of God: good, kind, all loving, benevolent. Then God wouldn't give knowledge or ideas just to one person over another, because that would be to prefer one person over another. And God cannot play favorites, by definition. We do because we're humans. But God's not human. He loves all of us equally. So he wants to give us the same, everything that we need. And so if something is true, it will pop up in many different places because no one would have the advantage over another. So if something is true, it's going to be manifested over here and eventually over there. There might be a little bit of difference in time, but it will come up in many different places because it is true. So as we carry out these experiments through mediumship, which is the ability to communicate with the other side of life that some people have more than others, we have been able to have these conversations and get more knowledge, play a new game of telephone, where we're now asking the people who initiated the message halfway through it. We don't have to wait for the message to go all around. We can raise our hands and say, hey, I heard this. Is this what it is? We can go back and keep checking our facts and go in the systematic process of when we find new facts that don't make sense, we don't brush them away saying that doesn't fit our original idea of the world. That might not be true. We say, how interesting. How does this fit with everything else that we've learned before? Should we reevaluate the way we do things? And by doing that, we are able to understand that as we progress, socially, scientifically, emotionally, we see things differently. We learn new things. So it's only natural that our concept of hell might change over time. Because maybe in the beginning, we lit a little bit of a telltale, right? Like we do this with children. Like, don't put your hand in the stove. You're going to get burned. Fire is bad. Don't do it, right? You're going to get an ouchie, right? Because they don't understand anything else because they're young. As they grow, you say, watch out with the fire because it might burn your hand. It might feel uncomfortable. And later on, when you're older, you understand that's a fire. So stop being like, don't do this, bad, to explaining why you shouldn't do it or why it doesn't benefit you. And maybe we're at that period of time. We are now graced with this great tool that allows us to go back and reevaluate all these concepts that we already knew, but we're seeing under a new light. Truth is, we have already been told all these things, but we haven't really listened, and we need to kind of over and over kind of get them repeated to us. Does that make sense? So it's important for us to look back and reevaluate things, and Spiritism is that tool that lets us do this, lets us get primary sources, go back to the good spirits, ask them what they mean by what was said then, and how do we look at it today. And we're able to reinterpret many, many beautiful different things. If we go back to our idea of the flags, we will see that we've learned many different things because of this interaction with those that have gone before us and are willing to come back and tell us about it. We have learned, for instance, about reincarnation, which is something we have lost through the ages. It makes sense. How could God, so kind and benevolent, judge us for a period of life, however short it might be, and then give us infinite peace or infinite torment after the fact? It doesn't make sense. Do you think a loving person would do this? Judge you for 1 second of your behavior and then punish you for the next 1,000 years for that? It makes no sense, right? And work this out with me. What if you did really great in that 1 second and you now are sitting on clouds playing harp with chubby angels? Okay, I'm pushing it, not angel, but chubby. What if you're sitting there, but you know somebody who wasn't that great in that specific second of time, and they were sent to the other place, right, downstairs? Would you be happy sitting on your cloud knowing that those who you love are there? So where's happiness? So it's impossible to be happy because we all have somebody we love, and chances are they might have misstepped a couple of times, or so have we. So it doesn't, this binary thing of like heaven forever or hell forever does not make sense. When we think and reevaluate the concept of God by what it is, not by what we've been handed down. And that's really difficult to do because it takes questioning of our own perceptions and beliefs, and that is extremely hard because sometimes it's our identity. I am this. I am a Spiritist, I am a Baptist, I am a Buddhist. We assume this identity and we put on this soccer shirt for this team that we like. And we don't question it anymore. That's just who we are. But again, we are in the realm of flags and minds, and we know that we need to reevaluate things. And when we do, we see reincarnation being such a powerful tool of justice, so beautiful. If we got things right, we can keep on doing them. We're going to reap the benefits. If we haven't, we will have another chance of getting it right. Either way, it's going to work out for us in the long run. There's something else that we get from looking at things too that's slightly different. We realize, and the Spirit tells us, that we have a free will. We have the ability to act on our lives. It's not predetermined. We have the ability to decide what is it that we're going to do and bear the consequences for our acts, which sometimes we forget. But that also bears something really important. When we begin to understand that there is no eternal damnation, and we are in control of our actions, then we are no longer just living for this faraway place in the future where we might go to the clouds or downstairs. We start living for every day in a positive way. We start thinking, hey, the consequences of my actions have a direct impact on my life tomorrow. I don't need to wait 60 years to find out whether I was good or not. I can know if I'm doing well by the consequences of my action. So it stops being a philosophy of the here. It stops being a philosophy of the hereafter, of thinking about this point in time when I go, then I'll figure things out, to I should be examining myself every single day because my actions matter, because my actions today affect tomorrow. It shifts the focus from this indefinite place in the future to now, to taking action now and knowing that you can change things. That no matter what you do, you can kind of work it out. And it also tells us there's a sense of togetherness here, because we're all together. If we're going through all this and learning about all of this, we know that we interact with each other, and maybe in more than one lifetime. We're in it together. For me to be happy, you have to be happy as well eventually. If I'm happy in detriment of your happiness, that doesn't work out. Nobody wins until everybody wins. Which is that example that we talked about. You can be in heaven, but if you have somebody that you love that's not, can you be happy? No, you can't. So it necessarily brings us in to a sense of community and sensing that we have a communal life in common. It's not about my happiness only. It's about also improving the world around me. It's also making it better for other people. And that's what the contact with the spirits and Spiritism brings, is a sense of community. It's not about just your personal evolution. Your evolution and your happiness is touched by and influenced by that of others. We stop being beings in isolation to beings that live in a community and might come back together in a community many times until we work things out. Because sometimes our shortcomings are dealing with other people, and we need to learn how to do that. And last but not least, it should also bring a great sense of hope. Because if there is no eternal damnation, if we have a chance to improve ourselves daily, are in control of most of our actions, let's be honest, some of them we're not so good at, but we are in charge of them. And if we know that life goes on, because the good spirits keep coming back and telling us that it does, reminding us that our actions have an impact in tomorrow, and that the ties that we create together today of happiness and of love are there forever, shouldn't that bring you hope? Shouldn't it bring you some kind of refreshment to your soul to know that the people that you befriend here today will be your friends for eternity? And that you had friends from before that are also rooting and cheering from you. And you have mothers and fathers from before who also love you in that manner. And that your pool of love, the love that you're exposed to, only grows with time. It only grows with time. Because as we reincarnate and come to different times, sometimes with the same father or mother, most of the time probably not, we are making these new circles of love. And our spiritual family that we talk about grows numerically. That's the spiritual family we talk about. The fact that we're adding to them all the time. Even those people we don't like so much. We're adding them now, and we'll like them better tomorrow. And we have a chance of working on it now so that we don't have to work on it tomorrow. If you know you're going to have to work on it, why wait? Why not get it done now? Wouldn't it be easier? But in short, it brings us a lot of hope. It should bring us a lot of hope because we stop seeing ourselves as isolated little beings who are just thinking about a day at a time. If you are going through your life and you find yourself overwhelmed by your day-to-day life, take a second to realize that there is a bigger thing at play here. That you are a child of God, loved by thousands, if not millions of spirits who are cheering for you, and that you can have an opportunity to decide how you see your day. Is it going to be the miserable day where you're going to go to work? Or is it going to be the day when you're going to go to work and create something and do something and impact the lives of others, no matter what it is, and you're going to do it well? Whether it's stuffing envelopes, whether it's guiding a nation, whether it's taking the trash out. You're going to do it with love, and you're going to make a difference. Because I tell you, envelopes need to be stuffed, and trash needs to be taken out. Go live in a world where trash is not taken out. Right? Take things into their due perspective. And it would be fascinating to find out that there is no eternal punishment. The only punishment is that which we inflict on ourselves. We hold ourselves back more than anything else. Why do we do this? Why do we still feed these thoughts, behaviors of eternal damnation that just serve to paralyze us? Maybe they were good in the past. Maybe they get us going because we're scared. But now that we're teenagers, we need to know why. And we're not running away something. Our goal in life should not be to not be bad. Like, oh, I don't want to be a bad person. That's not good enough. Be a great person. Because sometimes not being bad doesn't mean you're doing anything good either. So we remember that. Remember that you have a powerful influence on the life of those around you, and so do they with your life. And in a sense, I always tell this little story. You guys probably know this. Have you ever gone to a department store and have the little nails that are rusted? You know, you go to Home Depot or whatever it is, and they're like this rusty little nails. So you buy them like for a bag for like 10 cents, right? And so how do you get rid of the rust on these ones? Like, you're not going to sit there and kind of polish them off because that's more expensive than the price. It's not worth it. Do you know what they do, which is really smart? They take all these rusty nails together, they put it in a big vat, and they shake it. And then they rub against each other, and in rubbing against each other, the rust falls off. You open that vat, you have brand shiny new nails. So sometimes I think the earth is that big vat of nails where we're all tossed in there with our rust, and we come until we rub against each other and go, oops, 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 until we come out shiny and new for everybody. The process is a lot easier if you understand what's going on. If you know that's the end process, you might be willing to jump in. If you just don't know what's happening, not very pleasant. So all that to say, think big. Refuse these old ideas that no longer suit us. Dare to look forward and see what great things lie ahead of you. Dare to look back and say, there's a different way of looking at this now. This has served me a purpose before, but now I understand things differently. The concept of hell is one that has no longer a place for us in our minds. There's only one of responsibility. Because after all, there's no judgment by our own. And if we need to be reminded of that, because sometimes it still lingers, let us call us the great teacher of all times who talked to that adulterous woman who was about to be stoned and condemned by others. And he asked her, after all of them had left, did any of these people condemn you? And she says, no. And he said, and so neither do I. But go and don't do it again. And that is our learning. Let's all bygone be bygone. Start again. Remember, there's lots of love and hope. And don't think about these old images, but move yourself forward using your mind. Because neither the flag moves, nor the wind moves, but both of them move together in your mind. And from the bottom of my heart to the bottom of yours, I hope that you continue to exercise your mind and your heart so that you may step forward into the future, finding a joyous life full of meaning, full of pleasure, not only for you, but for those around you as well. Thank you for your patience.